It's the devastating story that's been swept under the carpet for more than 30 years now. Australian babies taken from their mothers at birth. The women, young and unmarried, were drugged and never saw their children again. This cruel act was committed time and time again by hospitals, adoption agencies, churches and government departments to some 300,000 women over 2 decades. They wanted to keep their babies but were given no option. Now, finally, there's an inquiry. Laura Sparks reports.
I had that disbelief for many years. In fact, it took me a couple of decades to realise just how awful and how consistent the cruelty was, and just how many babies were literally abducted in those years.
All of my rights were ignored. My legal rights and my human rights were totally ignored. He was stolen from me. Purely and simply, he was stolen from me. I can describe separating a baby from its mother at birth as a perversion of nature, as the most unnatural act that anyone ever conjured up.
Imagine giving birth to a child. You're only young yourself, perhaps 17, and never getting to see that baby you've carried in your womb for 9 months. Imagine having that baby wrenched away from you, and then being told to go out and get on with life. Well, that's exactly what happened 3 decades ago to up to 300,000 women around Australia. Their babies were labelled unwanted, but there could be nothing further from the truth.
And this was clearly a conspiracy between the people who prepared them to come to hospital and the people in the hospital itself.
Dr. Rickarby is a psychiatrist in Newcastle. He looks after hundreds of women who went through this horror back in the 60s and 70s. Young women who have had to cope with their grief and pain for 30 years, who were bullied into giving up their babies by churches, adoption agencies, welfare departments and hospitals. Authorities who he claims broke the law by forcing them into adoption.
They weren't supposed to promote adoption. They were supposed to obtain informed consent. They were to respect the rights of the mother as guardian of her child up until she signed the consent. They were breaking issues of the Act just time and time again.
He believes the authorities never gave the women alternatives, even though under the 1965 Adoption Act, these women were eligible for a mother's allowance, guardianship, foster care or special housing, and should have been informed of this.
They were told various things that were really meant to brainwash them. You wouldn't be able to care for a baby. This is a bad thing for the baby. It'll wreck the young man's life. They got to hospital ashamed of being pregnant, their predicament. They were really very distressed. It was a vulnerable time, birth, and they were in no way able to resist this. And because each one was dealt with singly, there was no hope.
It's unspeakable. An unspeakable crime has been committed, and it has to be recognised. It has to be acknowledged, and that's what this hearing is all about. A chance for the truth to be exposed.
Linda Gray